Welcome to the Disaster Management Marathon for Mains 2026. Let me begin with a simple claim. By the end of the next 3 minutes, I think you will agree with it. No section of GS3 gives you more marks per hour of preparation than this one. Here is the proof. Disaster management is a compact syllabus head, that is disaster and disaster management in one line, yet almost every mains examination since 2013 has carried a disaster management question worth 10 or 15 marks. And unlike economy or science and technology, where the syllabus is an ocean, this paper draws from a small stable set of hazards and frameworks that repeat in predictable patterns. Floods have been asked twice, earthquakes twice, landslides twice, cloudbursts twice. The examiner is not hiding from you. The examiner is telling you exactly where to look. And there is a second reason 2026 is the year this module pays out. For the first time in 20 years, Parliament has rewritten India's disaster management architecture. The Disaster Management Amendment Act of 2025 came into force in April 2025. The 16th Finance Commission has just recommended that heat waves and lightning be treated as notified disasters. A new urban disaster institution now exists in law. When the legal architecture of an entire syllabus head changes in the year before your exam. That is not background reading, that is the question paper announcing itself. So, this marathon makes you three promises. What are the three promises? One spine for every answer, one template for every hazard, one idea that unites the entire paper. So, comes to the spine. What is the damage and its mechanism? And why does governance or preparedness fail? And what risk reduction remedy is required? Damage, governance failure, and remedy. Every answer in this paper, from floods to stampedes, runs on those three movements. Three movements. That comes to the template part. The template mechanism affects named examples, mitigation framework. Master it once in chapter 1 and you can answer a hazard UPSC never even asked. That is why the template teaching is useful to you in an answer writing. Comes to the idea. For decades, disaster management meant relief, react, compensate, rebuild. The whole direction of the modern field of the 2025 Act, of the Sendai framework, and of UPSC's own questions in the move from relief to risk reduction. From reacting after to reducing risk before. So that is the thesis of this module. Every chapter will return to it. Comes to the route ahead. What is the route ahead? We build the concepts and the vocabulary. The 2025 Act has now made statutory. So we master the machinery, the DM Act and its transformation, and we anchor to Sendai and the money that funds it all. Then we cross every hazard family. Heat, the strongest untested bet for 2026. And floods, the most tested, earthquakes, and the geophysical hazards, the fragile Himalaya, cyclones, India's great success story, and the human induced disasters. This paper has never asked, but soon will ask. Soon will ask. So we close with the technology turning reaction into anticipation. We close with the technology turning reaction into the anticipation. And the community that no technology replaces. 11 chapters, one framework, one way of thinking. By the end of this marathon, disaster management should no longer feel like 11 chapters, 11 separate topics. It should feel like one paper that you know how to write. So let us begin with the chapter number 1, concepts, vulnerability, and resilience. So, so this is the regarding to the this is regarding the introduction of disaster management marathon. Welcome to the disaster management module. Before a single hazard, before floods, earthquakes, cyclones, we build the foundation. Because this paper is one on two things, and both are decided before you ever reach a specific disaster. I discussed already. The first is a template. Almost every question in this paper is about a specific hazard, and every hazard question has the same shape. That is, what is the mechanism? What are the effects? Give named examples. And what does the mitigation framework say? So you have to master the template once, and you can answer a hazard you have never seen. So then moving to the second is precision of concepts. UPSC repeatedly asks you to define what is resilience, what is vulnerability, how is risk assessed. And here is the good news for 2026. You no longer have to paraphrase this. The Disaster Management Amendment Act of 2025 has now put these definitions into law. This chapter hands you that statutory vocabulary, the precise language where the act reproduces it, and the statutory formulation where we simply for teaching. So, chapter 1 does two jobs. It fixes the concepts the examiner tests directly, and it arms you with the language that makes every latter answer precise. So, this is the foundation. Then we are moving to scene number 2, that is the three questions spine. Every answer in this paper, every answer in this paper runs on spine. Three movements. One, what is damage, and why and by what mechanism? Not a flood happened, but why and how disaster causes harm. Second one, why does governance or preparedness fail to prevent it? The institutional gap, the missing plan, the reactive mindset. So comes to the remedy part. What disaster risk reduction remedy is required? That is mitigation, preparedness, or resilience. Just relief. So damage, governance failure, remedy, and notice the shift built into the third movement, that is, for decades disaster management in India meant to relief, respond after the event, distribute compensation, and rebuild. The whole direction of modern disaster management and of UPSC's recent question is the move from relief to risk reduction, from reacting after to reducing risk before. Hold that shift, it is organizing idea of this whole paper. This I am repeating again till now. So comes to the scene number 3, that is the 4 building blocks: hazard, exposure, vulnerability, and risk. So to speak about disasters precisely, you must separate 4 ideas that students routinely blur together. So the 2025 Act now defines each. So in this, according to this defines definitions, a hazard is the dangerous phenomena itself, the earthquake, the cyclone, the cloudburst. The act defines it as a process or phenomena that may cause loss of life, injury, property damage, social and economic disruption, or environmental degradation. So a hazard is only a potential. An earthquake in an empty desert harms no one. So exposure is what stands in the hazard's path. The people, buildings, infrastructure, and assets located in hazard prone areas. This is called hazard. And then comes to the vulnerability. Vulnerability. We completed hazard, exposure, and then comes to vulnerability. Vulnerability is the susceptibility of those exposed elements to harm. Two cities hit by the same earthquake suffer differently. The difference is vulnerability, and the disaster risk is the combination all of these. So this given us the equation that anchors every risk answer, and it is now statutory, so you can state it with authority. So statutory risk equation, the DM Amendment Act 2025 defines disaster risk as the potential loss of life, property, infrastructure, economic and social function determined probabilistically 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 as a function of hazard, exposure, vulnerability and capacity. Vulnerability and capacity. So risk equal to F into F into hazard, exposure, vulnerability, capacity. So read the relationship carefully here, because the four terms do not pull the same way. Risk rises with hazard, exposure and vulnerability, but it falls as coping capacity rises. Capacity is the one variable that works in your favor. The last term, capacity. Capacity. Capacity is the hopeful one. It is ability to cope, respond and recover. Raise capacity and you lower risk without touching the hazard at all. Raise capacity and you lower risk without touching the hazard at all. That is the entire logic of disaster risk reduction in one variable. So in this section, in this scene, we discussed 4 building blocks that is now defined by 2025 Act. Those are hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. Then comes to capacity. Capacity is hopeful. Then comes to risk. These are all the things we discussed in this particular scene. Then we are moving to next scene, that is vulnerability. The 2019 question answered precisely. Vulnerability deserves its own scene, because UPSC asked in 2019 how vulnerability can be characterized. The different types. This is a define and classify question and precision scores. The Act defines vulnerability as the conditions determined by physical, social, economic, and environmental factors or processes that increase the susceptibility of an individual, community, asset, or system to the impact of a hazard. So take those factors and turn them into your answer structure. The first one is physical vulnerability. Physical vulnerability. Weak buildings, unsafe location, poor infrastructure, poor infrastructure, the unreinforced house on the floodplain. Social comes to this is all regarding physical. Then comes to social vulnerability. The elderly, children, the disabled, women, marginalized groups who cannot evacuate, cannot rebuild, cannot recover as easily. So this is belongs to social. And then comes to economic vulnerability. The poor who lost livelihoods and lack savings or insurance. This is comes to economic. Then comes to environmental. Environmental vulnerability. Degraded ecosystems that no longer buffer the hazard. Degraded ecosystems that no longer buffer the cleared mangrove. The cleared mangrove, the built over wetland, the deforested slope. And you can add institutional vulnerability also. Weak governance, no plan, and no early warning are related to this particular institutional vulnerability. So these are all vulnerabilities: physical vulnerability, social vulnerability, economic vulnerability, environmental vulnerability, and institution vulnerability. So, vulnerability is why the same hazard produces different disasters. Why the same hazard produces different disasters. The average answer treats a disaster as a natural event, but the top answer shows it is a social outcome. The hazard is natural, but the disaster is manufactured by vulnerability. The hazard is natural, but the disaster is manufactured by vulnerability. So there is no such thing as natural disaster, only natural hazards meeting human vulnerability. So no natural disaster, a natural hazard that meeting with human vulnerability. That is the important thing here. So comes to the PYQ corner. Vulnerability is an essential element for defining disaster impacts. Vulnerability is an essential element for defining disaster impacts. How and in what ways can vulnerability to disasters be characterized? Discuss different types of vulnerabilities. This is the question asked in 2019 10 marker question. So those are physical, social, economic, environmental, institutional vulnerabilities. Classify, then illustrate each. That is the answer. So then we are moving to resilience. After completing the vulnerability, we are moving to resilience. The 2024 question this is answered same verbatim. So now the concept at the center of modern disaster management is resilience. UPSC asked in 2024 what is disaster resilience, how is it determined, and what are the elements of a resilience framework. And the 2025 Act now gives you a statutory definitions to anchor your answer. So the statutory definition of resilience, the Disaster Management Amendment Act 2025 defines resilience as the ability of a system, community, or society exposed to hazards to resist, absorb, respond to, and recover from the effects of hazard in a timely and efficient manner. What is the resilience? Resilience. Resilience is the ability of a system, community, or society exposed to hazards to resist, absorb, respond to, and uncover and recover from the effects of a hazard a timely, efficient manner. This is called as resilience as far as DM Amendment Act 2025. So read those verbs because They are answer to how is resilience determined. Resist, resist, the strengthen, resist, the strength to withstand the shock, that is resist. Then comes to absorb. Absorb means what? Take the hit without collapse and then respond. Act effectively during the event, that is respond. And recover. Speed and complete, speed and completeness of bounce back. So these verbs: resist, the strengthen, the strength to withstand the shock; absorb, the capacity to take the hit without collapse; and respond, the ability to act effectively during the event. And then comes to recover, the speed and completeness of bouncing back. A resilient system does all four. A resilient system, a resilient system does all four, does all four. Robust physical infrastructure, robust robust physical infrastructure built to hazard resistant standards, then functioning institutions and plans, economic buffers, insurance, economic under the economic buffers, insurance, diversified livelihoods, contingency fund. Then comes to social capital and community networks like early warnings and preparedness, and ability to build back better, to recover in a way that reduces future risk, not merely restores the old vulnerability. The element of a resilient framework: this is the hazard and resistance infrastructure, economic buffers, social capital and community networks, and build back better, build back better. So these are the things under the elements of resilient framework. And resilience is not the absence of disaster, but the capacity to resist, but the capacity to absorb, but the capacity to respond and recover from it, and to build back better, so that recovery itself reduces future risk. We will return to the Sendai's frameworks global resilience targets in chapter 3. They are the international benchmark. This definition serves. So comes to the PYQ. What is disaster resilience? How is it determined? Elements of a resilient framework. Also mention the global targets of the Sendai framework. This is already I made a announcement in the starting of the question, starting of the scene. Then we are moving to scene number 6, that is the disaster management cycle. What is the disaster management cycle? Everything in this paper hangs on one cycle. The phases of managing a disaster over time. The 2025 Act now defines each phase. So use the exact terms. Before the disaster comes to the first point, before the disaster, the pre-disaster phase. And this is where the marks now live. In the pre-disaster phase, prevention, prevention, prevention. Prevention means what? Measures to avoid the hazard's adverse impact entirely. Then comes to mitigation. Mitigation measures to reduce the severity when it cannot be prevented. Comes to the preparedness. Preparedness means what? The knowledge and capacity to anticipate and respond. So this is the pre-disaster phase. In this, prevention, then mitigation, then preparedness are including in the pre-disaster phase. So the knowledge and capacity to anticipate and respond. So during and immediately after, the response phase, the response phase, action to save lives, reduce injury, ensure public safety, meet basic needs. And after, the recovery phase, now expanded in the Act to three ideas, that is rehabilitation, recovery, reconstruction. Rehabilitation. Rehabilitation means what? Restoring basic services and capacity. And recovery means what? restoring economic, physical, social, and environmental assets. Then reconstruction comes to reconstruction. Reconstruction means what? Rebuilding infrastructure, ideally building back better. So this is the pre-disaster phase, then responsive phase, and recovery phase. The reactive era, the reactive era lived in the response and relief and end of the cycle. Relief, end of the cycle. The reactive era, the reactive era lived in the response and relief end of the cycle. The modern and exam rewarded approach shifts weight to the pre-disaster end, that is prevention, mitigation, preparedness. When a question asks about disaster preparedness as the first step, as 2019 did, it is testing exactly this shift toward the front of the cycle. Comes to the PYQ, disaster preparedness is the first step in any disaster management process. Is this question asked in 2019 15 marker? As an administrator, what key areas would you focus on in a disaster management system? This question asked in 2013 10 marker question. So the answer is the pre-disaster phase, risk assessment, vulnerability mapping, preparedness, capacity building. This is the most important thing. The answer in the pre-disaster phase, risk reduction, risk assessment, then vulnerability mapping, then preparedness, and capacity building. These four are important for disaster pre-disaster phase. So then we are moving to closing the chapter. So let us close the foundation. We fixed the four building blocks: hazard, exposure, vulnerability, capacity, and the equation that binds them. Risk is their function. Risk is their function. We characterized vulnerability by type, the reason the same hazard we discussed. And then we are moving to the reason the same hazard production. Then we are moving to chapter number 2, that is disaster governance and the Disaster Management Amendment Act 2025. So the chapter 1 gives us the concepts. This chapter gives us the machinery, and it is without question the single most examinable chapter in the module of 2026. Why? Here is why. In 2020, UPSC asked about the recent measures in disaster management that mark a departure from the earlier reactive approach. That question has now been answered by Parliament itself. The Disaster Management Amendment Act 2025 received presidential assent on the 29th of March 2025 and came into force on the 9th of April 2025. The first substantive overhaul of the DM Act in 20 years. So the 2020 question is no longer a matter of listing scattered initiatives. It has a single decisive statutory answer for Mains 2026. This act is the central current affairs anchor for disaster governance. The development every examiner will be watching for. Treat this chapter as your headline. The single most examinable chapter for 2026. So then we are moving to scene number 2, that is original architecture, the DM Act 2005. To see what changed, you must first know the structure of 2025 Act reformed. So the Disaster Management Act 2005 was itself born of catastrophe. What is catastrophe or catastrophe? The 1919 Odisha super cyclone, the 2001 Bhuj earthquake, and above all, the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami. It created a three-tier institutional structure, top to bottom. At the apex, The National Disaster Management Authority, the NDMA, chaired by the Prime Minister, laying down policies and guidelines. At the state level, the State Disaster Management Authority, the SDMA, chaired by the Chief Minister. At the district level, the District Disaster Management Authority, the DDMA, chaired by the District Collector, where plans meet the ground. So, how can we support this? The national executive, who are supporting this? Supporting bodies, who are the supporters? Who are the supporting bodies? The National Executive Committee for Recommendation for Coordination, the National Executive Committee for Coordination, the National Institute of Disaster Management for Training and Research, then the National Disaster Response Force, the NDRF, the specialized force that has become the visible face of India's disaster response. That was the architecture. That was the architecture. Sound in design, but over 20 years, three weaknesses showed. It was committee heavy and slow. It was committee heavy and slow. The executive committees actually drafting the plans. It had no dedicated urban institution, even as cities became disaster hotspots, and it remained response oriented, lighter on risk reduction and mitigation. The 2025 Act targets exactly these three gaps. So we are moving to scene number three, that is the Amendment Act 2025, the headline reforms. What are the headline reforms? Now the act itself, get these provisions precise. Each one is citable current data anchor. So DM Amendment Act 2025 assented 29 March 2025, in force from 9th April 2025. The first major overhaul of the DM Act 2005. The first and most talked about reform, the Urban Disaster Management Authority. The Urban Disaster Management Authority. New section, that is 41A. So state governments may constitute a urban disaster management authority for state capitals and all cities with a municipal corporation, excluding Delhi, NCT, and Chandigarh. Chaired by the municipal commissioner, with the district collector as vice chair. It prepares an urban plan addressing city specific vulnerabilities, explicitly including urban flooding and heat waves. So, because it is a gift of two of your highest probability topics, that is the urban development, the urban disaster management authorities urban plan covers urban flooding, the theme of the 2024 and 2026 questions, and heat waves the strongest untested topic for 2026. For the first time, the law enables a dedicated urban disaster institution, though whether one exists in a given city depends on the state acting on that power. That enabling provision is itself a fresh and powerful answer. So you have to be very careful regarding with these two, urban disaster force, urban disaster management force, and authority, and this is heat wave, and then we have, and then we are moving to state disaster response. State disaster response, State Disaster Response Force, new section 44A. State governments may now constitute their own SDRF for specialist response, statutorily recognized, completing complementing the national NDRF. So the Act renames the relevant chapter simply Disaster Response Force. Disaster Response Force. And third one, statutory status for two long standing bodies. Statutory status for two standing bodies. Statutory committees, Section 8A, Section 8B, the National Crisis Management Committee, chaired by the Cabinet Secretary, the nodal body for disasters with national ramifications, and the high level committee which approves financial assistance for mitigation, both existed before as executive bodies. The act now gives them statutory status. So I am repeating these things again because these are most important for 2026 examination. The Amendment Act 2025, the headline reforms. The DM Amendment Act 2025 assented 29th March 2025 in force from 9th April 2025. That is clear. The first major overhaul of the DM Act 2005, that is the first and most talked about reform, that is the Urban Disaster Management Authority. The Urban Disaster Management Authority. Urban Disaster Management Authority, new section, that is 41A. So, under this section, state governments may constitute a UDMA. UDMA means Urban Disaster Management Authority. Urban Disaster Management Authority for state capitals and all cities with a municipal corporation, excluding Delhi NCT and Chandigarh. These are chaired by the municipal commissioner with the district collector as vice chair. It prepares an urban, it prepares an urban plan addressing city specific vulnerabilities, explicitly including urban flooding and heat waves, urban flooding and heat waves. Then this is a gift. I am telling you, pass on the last line. Pass on the last line. It prepares an urban plan. It prepares an urban plan addressing city specific vulnerabilities, explicitly including urban flooding and heat waves. It prepares an urban plan addressing city specific vulnerabilities, explicitly including urban flooding and heat waves. So these are highest probability topics. The UDMA's urban plan covers urban flooding, the theme of the 2024 and 2016 questions, and heat waves, the strongest untested topic for 2026. For the first time, the law enables a dedicated urban disaster institution. Though whether one exists in a given city, though whether one exists in a given city depends on the state acting on that power. So that enabling provision is itself a fresh and powerful answer. So second one, the state disaster response force. State disaster response force under new section 44A, state governments may now constitute their own SDRF for specialist response. Statutorily recognized, complementing the national NDRF, the Act renames the relevant chapter simply Disaster Response Force. So, third one, the statutory status for two long standing bodies. For two long standing bodies. Statutory Committee Section 8A, Section 8B, the National Crisis Management Committee, chaired by the Cabinet Secretary, the nodal body for disasters with national ramifications, and the high level committee which approves financial assistance for mitigation, both existed before as executive bodies. The act now gives them statutory status. So comes to the deeper shift. What is the deeper shift from committees to authorities? Reaction to risk. So so comes to this, the deeper change is a shift in how disaster management is done, and this is where the marks are. Power moves from committees to the authorities. Power moves to the committees to authorities. Authorities themselves. Power moves from Power moves from committees to the authorities themselves. Under the old act, the national and state executive committees prepared the plans. Now the NDMA and SDMAs prepare the plans directly, a leaner, more accountable line of authority. The NDMA may also appoint its own experts and consultants, and it asked to take stock of the entire range of disaster risks across the country. And here is the clause that captures the whole philosophy of the act, the statutory embodiment of the reactive to proactive shift, of the reactive to proactive shift. The emerging disaster risks, the emerging disaster risks clause, the act empowers authorities to address emerging disaster risks, explicitly clarified as risks of those disasters that may not have taken place but may occur in future due to extreme climate events. So read that carefully. The law now requires India to plan for disasters that have not happened yet, like heat waves, climate induced floods, biological threats. That is the definition of a proactive risk reduction mindset written into statute. It is also the statutory hook for every emerging hazard answer in this module. What is the supporting machinery here? A new national and state disaster database, including a risk register by type and severity, and a requirement for state specific hazard wise space, and a requirement for state specific hazard wise nodal departments. Disaster management moves from reacting to events to mapping and reducing risk before them. So the Disaster Management Amendment Act 2025 advances India's transition from a relief centric to a risk reduction based framework, enabling urban authorities, empowering the NDMA and SDMA to plan directly, and mandating preparedness for emerging climate induced disaster risks. So then we are moving to next scene, that is the critique, the federalism question. A top answer never just praises a reform, it weighs it. And the 2025 Act has a genuine critical dimension. You must carry the question of federalism. Disaster management is a subject of shared cooperative responsibility. The center sets the framework, but states and districts do the actual work. Because disasters are local before they are national. The concern with the 2025 Act is that it may be tilted that balance toward the center. The expanded role of NDMA in national planning, minimum standards, technical guidance, and preparedness assessment has raised concerns that excessive central direction could constrain state level flexibility. A shift from cooperative toward a more directive federalism. So this is federal tilt. NDMA expanded role, national planning, minimum standards, preparedness assessment raises concerns, a shift from cooperative toward directive federalism. So constraining the state reliability. So there is a second concern. This is the first one, federal tilt means center tilt. There is second concern worth naming, that is the act can add institutional layers. A UDMA sitting alongside the existing DDMA without necessarily providing the matching funds and capacity to make them work. New authorities without new resources can become paper bodies, and the Act omitted the earlier statutory advisory committees, which some see as reducing independent expert input into the disaster policy. So the balanced verdict, the 2025 Act is a genuine and overdue modernization. It fills the urban gap, empowers the authorities, and mandates risk reduction, but its success depends on matching devolved funds and the capacity to the new bodies and on preserving cooperative federalism rather than centralizing a fundamentally local function. So, layers without resources. Last expert input. So, comes to the PYQ corner. Discuss the reset measures initiated in disaster management by the government of India, departing from the earlier reactive approach. So, this question asked in 2020, 15 marker question. In 2026, this question has one commanding answer. That is the Disaster Management Amendment Act 2025. Lead with it, detail the reforms, and close with the federalism critic. critic. So then we are moving to next scene, that is closing chapter second. So the DM Act 2005 built the three-tier structure NDMA, SDMA, DDMA, sound in design but slow urban blind and response oriented. The DM Amendment Act 2000 2025 answers all three: the Urban Disaster Management Authority for cities, covering floods and heat waves, the State Disaster Response Force, statutory status for the NCMC and HLC, planning plan making moved to the authorities, and the emerging disaster risks clause that writes proactive, then climate aware risk reduction into law. And we held the federalism critic, that is modernization that must not become centralization. The spine held throughout the move from relief to risk reduction, now completed in statute. But India's disaster framework does not stand alone. It answers to a global compact, that is the Sendai framework, and it runs on money through a disaster finance architecture that the 16th Finance Commission has just reshaped. So that is the chapter number 3, that is Sendai, the global frameworks and a disaster finance. Then we are moving to chapter number 3, that is Sendai global framework and disaster finance. So why the global frame matters? Why the global frame matters? Chapter 2 gave us India's machinery. These chapters give us two things that machinery answers to: a global compact and money. Two things: global compact and money. The global compact is the Sendai framework. Here is the Sendai framework. And UPSC tests it relentlessly. UPSC tests it relentlessly. It appeared directly in 2018 and again in 2024. And its vocabulary: risk reduction, resilience, build back better, runs underneath almost every modern disaster question. So if chapter 2 was your headline, Sendai is your framework anchor. The thing you cite to show your answer is aligned with the global state of the art. The money is the disaster finance. The money is disaster finance. So because every plan, every mitigation project, every relief effort runs on funds, and the architecture of those funds is being shaped for the coming years by the 16th Finance Commission recommendations. A disaster answer that ignores finance is incomplete. So this chapter arms you with the international benchmark and fiscal machinery, the two frames that sit above every hazard we will study. Then we are moving to next scene, that is Hyogo to Sendai, the shift that defines modern disaster management. To understand Sendai framework, you must see what it replaced, because the shift is the answer. Before Sendai came, before Sendai came the Hyogo framework for action. 2005 to 2015, the world's first major disaster compact adopted after the 2004 tsunami. Hyogo was a genuine step forward, but it had a defining limitations. Its focus on managing disasters, reducing disaster losses, strengthening response, preparing to react. But comes to the Sendai framework, the Sendai framework 2015 to 2030 adopted in Sendai, Japan, made a decisive conceptual move from managing disasters to managing disaster risk, from reducing losses after to reducing the underlying risk before. So, like prevention. So, from a task, from a task of government, for governments and agencies, a whole of society responsibility. From a task for governments and agencies to a whole of society responsibility, shifted like this. That is the shift the 2018 question asked you to explain, and it is the heart of the topic. Hyogo managed disasters, Sendai manages risks. The one line contrast that scores, Hyogo focused on disaster loss reduction and response, but Sendai shifted the paradigm to disaster risk reduction, prevention over reaction, and a whole of society approach. These two lines are most important. Notice the same. Notice this is the same relief to risk reduction shift we saw in India's own 2025 Act. The 2025 amendment translates Sendai's risk reduction philosophy into India's statutory framework. Then we are moving to the Sendai framework, four priorities, seven targets. What are the four priorities and what are the seven targets? Now the content the 2024 question demanded, the structure of Sendai itself. Learn the four priorities and the seven targets, they are pure citable marks. The four priorities for action, the what to do, the what to do. Sendai's four priorities. One is understand disaster risk. Second one, strengthening risk governance. Third one, invest in DRR for resilience, enhance preparedness, and building back better. So comes to the first one, understand disaster risk. Data assessment, risk knowledge. Second one, strength disaster risk governance, institutions, laws coordination. And third one, invest in disaster risk reduction for resilience. This is the mitigation money. And then fourth one, enhance preparedness for effective response and to build back better in recovery. So remember them in as a remembering remember them as a sequence. Understand the risk, govern it, invest it, invest against it, and prepare for it. So the seven, so remember them as a sequence. Understand the risk, govern it, invest against it, and prepare for it. The seven global targets, the measurable goals. You don't need every word, but you must show you know they are outcome based and time bound. Sendai 7 global targets 2030. The first four: reduce disaster mortality, the number of people affected direct economic loss, the number of people affected, direct economic loss, and the damage to critical infrastructure and services. The last three: increase countries with national and local disaster risk reduction strategies, that is called DRR. International cooperation for developing countries, and access to multi-hazard early warning systems and risk information. Four reductions, three increases. That framing alone shows command of the target set. DRR measures before and after signing Sendai. How it differs from Hyogo? This question asked in 2018, 15 marker question. Resilience framework also mentioned the global targets of the Sendai framework. This question asked in 2024, 15 markers. So both reward the priorities and target structure above plus the Hyogo to Sendai shift. Then we are moving to next scene, that is India and Sendai. India and Sendai. So we discussed seven global targets earlier. Four reductions, three increases. Three increases. So, four reductions: what? Disaster mortality, number of people affected, direct economic loss, and damage to critical infrastructure and services. I repeating. And then next increase. Countries with national increase. Countries with national and local DRR strategies. These are etc. Outcome based and time bound. These are the PYQs. 2018 PYQ, 2024 PYQ. Then we are moving to scene number 4, that is India and Sendai. Alignment and leadership. The 2018 question asked what India did before and after Sendai. So show the alignment. India was an early and active party to Sendai and has progressively brought its own system into line. The National Disaster Management Plan of 2016, India's first, was explicitly aligned to Sendai's four priorities and revised thereafter. The Prime Minister articulated a 10-point agenda on disaster risk reduction that extended Sendai's thinking. And crucially, the Disaster Management Amendment Act of 2025 from our last chapter raised Sendai's core idea, that is disaster risk reduction, directly into Indian law. So India has also led internationally, and this ends real credit in an answer. So India's global DRR leadership, India co-founded the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure launched in 2019, a global partnership to make infrastructure resilient to disasters and climate. India is leading voice for early warning access and resilient infrastructure in the global south. India has moved from a Sendai signatory to Sendai leader, aligning its national disaster management plan and its 2025 law to the framework, and championing resilient infrastructure globally through the CDRI. So, and here the CDRI's work turns concrete at home, mainstreaming disaster resilience into infrastructure. A recent CDRI linked assessment with the Department of Economic Affairs and the Finance Ministry argues that India must protect a multi-trillion rupee infrastructure pipeline from climate and disaster risk. The approach integrates climate risk assessment into the national infrastructure pipeline across roads, power, and rail. The honest trade-off to name here is resilience can rise upfront project costs, but the life cycle savings from avoided damage can make it substantially cheaper than repeated post-disaster reconstruction. This is build back better applied before the disaster, resilience by design, not repair. CDRI assessment figures for CDRI assessment figures, that is 4.51 trillion infrastructure in pipeline, more or less. Disaster losses up to 2% of GDP annually. Resilience premium 10 to 20% upfront. Attribute to the CDRI linked report, not as freestanding facts. So resilient infrastructure mainstreaming disaster resilience into infrastructure. Resilient infrastructure is what? Mainstreaming disaster resilience into infrastructure. Screening climate risk into the project pipeline. Costs more upfront but protects a multi-trillion rupee asset base. Resilience by design is cheaper than recovery by default. So this is the. So then we are moving to scene number 5, that is disaster finance. The two fund architecture. The two fund architecture, sir. Now the money. And the key is a single distinction that scores instantly. The difference between response funds and mitigation funds. Response funds is are response funds after, then mitigation funds before. So for decades, India's disaster funds were purely for response, for relief after the event. This is the reactive model in fiscal form. The reform, completing the shift to risk reduction, was to create dedicated mitigation funds to spend before the disaster. So the disaster finance architecture response funds, the National Disaster Response Fund and State Disaster Response Funds for relief and immediate response. Comes to mitigation funds. Before we discuss two are response funds, then mitigation funds we are going to discuss. The National Disaster Mitigation Fund and State Disaster Mitigation Funds for pre-disaster risk reduction. Under the 2025 Act, the High Level Committee approves financial assistance for mitigation. That Under the 2025 Act, the High Level Committee approves financial assistance for mitigation. Please remember two words: response funds and mitigation funds. That response fund plus mitigation fund pairing is the whole logic of modern disaster finance. Money to recover and money to prevent. And the channel for state disaster funds is the Finance Commission, which brings us the freshest development in this space. The 16th Finance Commission submitted its report on 17th November 2025, covering the 2026 to 2031 award period. Its recommendations to states include dedicated disaster management grants, the constitutional channel through which state disaster funds flow. The 1.4 lakh crore figure sometimes cited is the total finance commission grant pool for the year, not the disaster component alone. Keep the two distinct in an answer. Please remember this. Please be careful with this. Note two distinction that matters most here. The 16th Finance Commission has recommended the disaster finance framework, including, as we will see in the heat and lightning chapters, that heat waves and lightning be treated as notified disasters. A recommendation is not yet a government notification. State it was state it as what it is. Recommended for the 2026-31 award period, awaiting acceptance and notification. So this is the data anchor. Heat waves 1.4 lakhs. 1.4 lakh crore figures as a total FC grant for the year, not the disaster component alone. Be careful with this. Then we are moving to next scene, that is the frontier. Risk financing, insurance, build back, build back better. So beyond the funds lies the frontier of disaster finance, and it is where 2026 marks may hide. Beyond the funds lies the frontier of disaster finance, and it is where 2026 marks may hide. The traditional model is post disaster, pay for damage after it happens. The modern shift to the modern shift is toward anticipatory risk financing, arranging the money before the disaster. So response is instant and planned, not scrambled. So this is disaster risk insurance we are going to discuss. The instruments to name: the disaster risk insurance for crops, homes, and public assets transferring risk of government balance sheets. Then second one, parametric insurance. What is parametric insurance? The parametric insurance is which pays out automatically when a trigger is crossed. A temperature threshold or a rainfall level with no lengthy claim process. So catastrophe. Then we are moving to catastrophe bonds. Catastrophe bonds. Capital market instruments that fund recovery used internationally and a frontier option India is exploring rather than an established domestic tool. And risk pooling, spreading exposure across regions or states. And the principle that ties every back to the risk reduction, build back better. When you rebuild after a disaster, you do not restore the old vulnerability. You rebuild stronger and safer and more resilient so that the next hazard causes less harm. Build back better is Sendai's fourth priority made concrete, and it is the bridge between the response phase and the genuine risk reduction. So risk pooling we discussed. Risk pooling, spreading exposure across regions of states. This is build back better. This is Sendai's fourth priority. So India's disaster finance is shifting from a purely post-disaster relief model toward anticipatory risk financing. Mitigation funds, disaster insurance, and parametric instruments reflecting the Sendai principle that money spent on risk reducing risk is cheaper than money spent on recovering from it. So we are moving to scene number 7, that is the Hyogo to Sendai shift defines modern disaster management. This is closing 7. Scene number 7, that is chapter close and bridge. Close the framework and finance chapter here is the Hyogo to Sendai shift defines modern disaster management, from managing disasters to managing risk, from reaction to prevention, from government task to whole of a society responsibility. Sendai's four priorities and seven targets are your citable anchor, and India has moved from signatory to leader. The NDMP, the 2025 Act, and the CDRI and finance, the response funds plus mitigation fund architecture shaped by the 60th Finance Commission recommendations and the frontier of risk financing and insurance, all serving one Sendai idea, that is build back better. We know we now have the full frame. We now have the full frame: concepts, machinery, global impact, global compact, and money. Everything above the hazards is in place. From the next chapter, we descend into the hazards themselves, and we begin with one of the strongest candidates for 2026. The disaster India can no longer ignore: heat. This is that is the chapter number 4, that is heat waves and urban heat resilience. So comes to the heat part, the strongest bet for 2026 we are predicting. We now leave the framework and enter the hazards, and we open deliberately with the heat. Here is the case for why heat is high priority topic for 2026. It has not yet been asked as a standalone question in this paper's history. A notable gap for a hazard that has become one of India's deadliest and most undercounted climatic hazards. And in the last year, three things have converged on it. The 16th Finance Commission recommending the heat waves be treated as a notified disaster. The Disaster Management Amendment Act of 2025 which enables states to constitute urban authorities whose plans can address heat waves and other city specific risks. And a growing public debate about the legislative vacuum around heat protection. That is why a syllabus central high mortality hazard, a syllabus central high mortality hazard never tested with three fresh developments. That is the definition of a high probability question. So prepare it thoroughly and note this chapter connects directly to the environment marathon's work on heat. So there we treated heat as a public health and labor rights crisis. Here we treat it as a disaster to be managed, mitigated and governed. Same phenomena, disaster management lens. So this is 16th Finance DM Act, syllabus central, high mortality never tested. Then we are moving to scene number 2, that is the hazard. What makes heat lethal? Apply the hazard template here. Begin with the mechanism. A heat wave is a period of abnormally high temperature, but the number on the thermometer is not what kills. What kills is the combination of heat and humidity captured in the wet bulb temperature. Here is the mechanism, and naming it precisely scores. The human body shed heat by sweating, sweat evaporates, and evaporation cools. This is the mechanism. But evaporation only works if the surrounding air is dry enough to accept the moisture. When humidity is high, sweat cannot evaporate and the body cannot shed its heat. So a wet bulb temperature approaching 35 degrees temperature 35 degrees Celsius represents an extreme theoretical limit of human survivability. The point at which even a healthy person resting in the shade cannot cool down. But, and this is the important qualification, dangerous heat stress occurs well below that limit, especially for outdoor workers, the elderly, the sick, and the very young. The 35-degree figure is the ceiling, not a line below which heat is safe. That is why humid coastal heat wave can be deadlier than hotter, dried inland one. The dry bulb temperature understates the danger, then wet bulb reveals it. So naming the wet bulb mechanism, heat plus humidity defeating the body's cooling with 35 degrees Celsius as the theoretically survivability ceiling and serious danger well below it. So is what fits a heat answer from it gets very hard to a precise psychological explanation. So we discussed body cooling system, humidity defeats it, the coastal paradox. So the coastal paradox, that is why a humid coastal heat wave can be deadlier than a hotter drier inland one. The dry bulb temperature understates the danger, the wet bulb reveals it. Then we are moving to scene number 3, that is effects. The effects, a multi-dimensional disaster. Now the effects, and the key insight is that heat is not one disaster but several at once. It is a public health disaster. Heat stroke, cardiovascular and kidney stress with elderly children, pregnant women and the sick most at risk. It is a labor and economic disaster, public health disaster, and labor and economic disaster. India's vast outdoor workforce in construction, agriculture and street work cannot stop when the temperature climbs. So heat means lost productivity, lost wages, lost lives also. The scale is measurable. The ILO, International Labor Organization, projects that heat stress could cost India the equivalent of 10 of millions of jobs by 2030. concentrated in agriculture and construction. Heat is not a comfort problem. It is a shock to the workforce and the economy. So comes to the heat data. Comes to the heat data. WHO guidance, World Health Organization, core body temperature should not exceed 38 degrees over an 8-hour shift, 38 degrees Celsius. Now routinely breached. Comes to ILO part, 34 million job equivalents at risk in India by 2030. Both agriculture and construction together. It is an urban disaster. Cities suffer the urban heat island effect, where concrete and asphalt trap heat, making cities several degrees hotter than their surroundings. And the hottest of all at night, denying the body its recovery. And it is a justice disaster. The poor live in heat, trapping informal housing, work outdoors, and lack access to cooling. It is not felt equally. Urban and justice thing. So, and it strains other systems is in cascade. What is cascade? Power grids buckle under cooling demand, water sources dry up, crops wither, and there is a cruel loop, that is more heat drives more air conditioning, which on a fossil grid drives more warming. So that is the cooling paradox. That is the cooling paradox. Adaptation feeding that every problem it responds. That is why the cooling paradox, cascading effect, and it strains other systems in a cascade. Power grids buckle under cooling demand, water sources dry up, crops wither, and there is a cruel loop. More heat drives more air conditioning, which on a fossil grid drives more warming. That is the cooling paradox. Adaptations, feeding the every feeding the very problem it responds to it. And there is answer dimension, and there is a newer dimension. The climate is now adding the early heat wave. In recent years, North India has seen a sudden transition from winter to summer like heat in February and March, effectively bypassing the traditional spring. This early onset is driven by dry winters, weakened western disturbances, persistent high pressure, anticyclones, and the longer term warming trend. It is danger is that it arrives when nothing is prepared for it. It hits the rabi crop during grain filling, terminal heat stress on wheat and mustard. It spikes power demand months earlier than the grid expects, and it catches health systems and workers before heat action plans have activated. An unseasonal heat wave is more dangerous precisely because of it unseasonal. So heat is a multi-dimensional disaster, simultaneously a health emergency, a labor and economic shock, an urban crisis intensified by the heat island effect, and a justice issue borne most heavily by the poor. And its onset is now shifting earlier, striking before defenses are ready. So this is the phenomena, the early heat wave we felt in North India. So then we are moving to next scene, that is management. Heat management, heat action plans, and the legislative vacuum. Now comes to the management part, and the central story here is a gap between action and law. India's frontline responses is the heat action plan. Heat action plan. A city or state plan that combines early warning, public awareness, adjusted working on school hours, cooling shelters, and preparedness of hospitals. That the pioneer and the model to cite is Ahmedabad, which launched South Asia's first heat action plan in 2013 after a deadly 2010 heat wave. Its approach color coded temperature warnings, a chain of alerts, a community outreach has been widely replicated. Separately, Ahmedabad has also seen a parametric heat insurance initiative for women workers that pays out automatically when temperature crosses a threshold. A distinct program, not part of the municipal heat action plan itself, but a valuable example of financial protection against heat. Another citable model is Jodhpur's passive cooling community station, which stays markedly cooler during peak afternoon hours without heavy energy use. But here is the critical gap: the legislative vacuum. A very large informal workforce, hundreds of millions of outdoor workers, remains outside any enforceable heat safety law. Heat action plans are Heat action plans are for the most part, advisory, not legally binding. Existing labor law protects indoor workers far better than the outdoor workers. Av- And because heat waves are not on notified disaster list, states cannot freely draw disaster funds for heat relief. India acts against heat by administrative goodwill, not by enforceable right. A shift, as researchers put it, from seasonal hardship to systematic thermal injustice. The legal caps are 57% of Indian districts now heat prone. 490, more or less 490 million informal workers unprotected. Factories Act 1948, indoor workers only. OSH Code 2020 dropped outdoor heat as mandatory concern. Gig or contract workers excluded as contractors. The 10% drop heat of the notified list is equal to no disaster funds. So the reform that scores move from advisory heat action plans to enforceable thermal safety rights. A right to cool, read into Article 21, binding work rest personal protective equipment standards under the OSH code. The heat indexes, the heat index, temperature plus humidity, as the legal safety trigger, wage protection through parametric insurance for informal workers, cool roofs, and urban tree cover, and heat written into building codes and labor law. The average answer lists relief measures, but top answer lists what the top answer demands a legal framework and point to precedents that proves it is a doable. Qatar bans outdoor work during peak summer hours from mid-morning to mid-afternoon with mandatory shaded rest. Australia integrates climate projections directly into workplace safety standards for mining and agriculture. These show enforceable heat safety law is not aspirational. Other economies already have it. So, from advisory plan to thermal safety rights. So then we are moving to chapter number 4, scene 5. Next scene, that is the 2025 2026 developments. Notified disaster and the Urban authority. Now the fresh developments that make this a 2026 question, and there are two. The first concerns whether heat is officially a disaster at all. This matter enormously because notified disaster status unlocks dedicated disaster funds, the NDRF and SDRF, for prevention and relief. Historically, heat waves were not on the official list of notified disasters. So states struggle to fund a heat response from disaster money. The 16th Finance Commission has recommended changing this, the heat waves and lightning be treated as notified disasters for the 2026 to 31 award period. Keep the distinction sharp. So this is a recommendation, not a government notification, prompted by record breaking temperatures and rising fatalities in 24-25. If accepted and notified, it would open dedicated disaster financing for heat action for the first time. So that is why it is one of the most significant heat developments to watch for 2026. And here is where you can show real analytical depth is because recognizing heat as a notified disaster is not straightforward. Carry the challenges of inclusion also. Death attribution, proving heat as the primary cause is medically complex. During the 2024 heat waves, deaths were often recorded as fever rather than heat stroke, fiscal strain, compensation payouts, especially for thousands of lightning deaths, could escalate the center's burden sharply. So, widespread occurrences. Heat waves span vast regions, complicating the identification of a discrete disaster zone. So, data accuracy, rural under reporting disaster distorts fund allocation, and the incentive to misreport. New compensation categories can inflate claims. Then the way it is. So here challenges of inclusion, death attribution, physical strain, widespread occurrences, data accuracy, and misreporting incentive. So comes to the way heat part. Setable measures. What are the setable measures? Dynamic state specific temperature and wet bulb thresholds for declaring a heat wave because a single national number cannot fit every climate zone. Parametric insurance to protect farmers and outdoor workers from wage loss. Last mile alerts delivered through Apada Mitra volunteers in the fields. Urban cooling, cool roof policies, and green corridors under the Smart Cities mission. And scientific death audits, medical boards to certify heat fatalities transparently, fixing the attribution problem at its root. So here dynamic hmm, this the second is urban disaster management authority. Urban Disaster Management Authority from chapter number 2. Recall its urban plan is meant to address city specific vulnerabilities. And the act names heat waves explicitly alongside flooding. So the law now enables for the first time a dedicated urban institution plan for heat, where a state chooses to constitute one. Comes to the pair the two. Notified disaster status Notified disaster status would bring the money, and the UDMA provision brings the institutional mandate. Together, they point toward heat's arrival as a governed disaster rather than unmanaged summer emergency. The recommendation to recognize heat waves as a notified disaster, together with the Urban Disaster Management Authority's mandate to plan for heat, points toward a shift from treating heat as an unmanaged seasonal emergency to a financed, then institutionally governed disaster through enforceable heat protection rights remain the missing place. So here urban authorities heat mandate. First one the money, notified disaster status, then UDMA's urban plan. So these are the things. So I will repeat it again. I will repeat it again. The second is Urban Disaster Management Authority from chapter number 2. Recall its urban plan is meant to address city specific vulnerabilities, and the act names heat waves explicitly alongside flooding. So the law now enables for the first time a dedicated urban institution to plan for heat, where a state chooses to constitute one. Comes to the pair 2, that is notified disaster status would bring the money, and UDMA provision brings the institutional mandate. Together, they point towards heats as arrival as a governed disaster rather than an unmanaged summer emergency. The recommendation, the recommendation to recognize heat waves as a notified disaster, together with urban disaster management authorities, mandate to plan for heat, points toward a shift from treating heat as unmanaged seasonal emergency to a financed institutionally governed disaster through enforceable heat protection rights remain the missing place. So we are closing this chapter. The mechanism is the wet bulb temperature with about 35 degrees as the theoretical survivable ceiling, and dangerous heat stress striking well below it, and dangerous heat stress striking well below it, especially the vulnerable. The effects are multidimensional: health, labor, urban justice, amplified by the heat island effect and the cooling paradox. Management runs through heat action plans, Ahmedabad model, Ahmedabad the model, but sits inside a legislative vacuum that reform must fill with enforceable rights. And the 2025-2026 developments, notified disaster status and the urban authorities heat mandate are bringing heat at last under governed disaster management. Set it against the spine. Comes to the damage, a lethal multidimensional hazard. Rising the climate. Comes to the governance failure. Advisory plans, no legal force. Heat long outside disaster finance. Comes to the remedy part: notified disaster funding, urban authorities, and enforceable thermal safety rights. It is a slow, pervasive hazard. The next is sudden and visible, and it is the paper's most tested hazard of all: water in the city. That is chapter number 5: floods, urban flooding, and a nature based solutions. So, what is urban floods, urban flooding? Hmm? What is the paper's most tested hazard? If heat is the strongest emerging bet, floods are the paper's most reliable hazard. Floods and urban floods specifically have been asked again and again. 2016 and 2024, which framed urban flooding as an emerging climate induced disasters. Floods remaining among the most consistently tested hazards. Prepare it as a core recurring hazard rather than a peripherally possibility. So, and note the evolution is now it is asked. The paper has moved from the general river flood to the urban flood, and from treating it as an engineering problem to treating it as climate and governance problem. So the 2024 word climate induced is the signal. So this chapter cleans into the urban flooding. It's a climate driver, and crucially the new institutions created to govern it. India is one of the most flood prone countries in the world. A large share of our land is flood prone, fed by the monsoon, the Himalayan rivers, and as an increasingly erratic and high intensity rainfall pattern. So here the riverine floods, the baseline. Start with the classical flood, the riverine flood to set the baseline. What is the mechanism under the riverine floods? What is the mechanism? A river receives more water than its channel can carry from intense monsoon rainfall, snow melt, upstream release, or and it overtaps its banks onto the floodplain. A river receives more water than its channel can carry from intense monsoon rainfall or snow melt or upstream release, and it overtaps the banks onto the floodplain. For example, the Ganga, Brahmaputra, Meghana Basin, Assam, Bihar, and eastern UP bear this almost every year. The causes, what are the causes? The causes are natural and human together. Heavy and erratic rainfall, silting that raises riverbeds and reduces capacity, deforestation in catchments accelerating runoff, and importantly, embankments and dams that can worsen floods by trapping silt, breaching under pressure, or forcing sudden release downstream. That last point is the debate to carry. Embankments are a double-edged tool. They protect in the short term but raise riverbeds over time. So a breach becomes catastrophic. The modern view favors living with flood, floodplain zoning, room for the river, over endlessly raising embankments. So the reform vocabulary, from flood control to fightening the river with concrete, to flood management to accommodating it through zoning, catchment care, and giving the river room, the same hold the line versus live with it. shift we saw the course in the environment marathon. So here we discussed embankment debate is most important. Then we are moving to urban floods, a manufactured disaster. Now the heart of the chapter, the urban flood, and the defining insight is that it is largely manufactured, not natural. A city floods not simply because it rained hard, but because the city has destroyed its own ability to absorb and drain water. Walk through the causes. What are the causes for urban flooding? Encroached. What are the causes? Each is a scoring point. Encroached and vanished wetlands, the natural sponges that once held stormwater built over real estate. Built over for real estate. Concretized and sealed surfaces. Water that soaked once into the ground now runs off instantly, all of it at once. Choked, choked, choked and inadequate drains. Inadequate storm drains clogged with the solid waste designed for a rainfall the climate now routinely exceeds. Then comes to the construction, floodplain construction, construction on floodplain and natural drainage channels. Building in the very path water needs to take high intensity rainfall. And the final thing that is high intensity rainfall, the climate driver. More rain in few hours overwhelming systems built for gentler patterns. So the 2024 framing is exactly right. Urban flooding is a climate induced disaster, but the vulnerability that turns heavy rain to catastrophe is man made. So, urban flooding is as much a governance and land use failure as a meteorological event. Cities that encroaches wetlands, seal their ground, and choke their drains convert every high intensity rainfall into a disaster of their own making. So comes to the case study bank, cite these with a salient features. Each Chennai 2015 encroached Adayar, Kuam floodplain and lost wetlands, weeks of paralysis. Comes to Mumbai 2005 Mithi River encroachment 944 mm in a day overwhelmed colonial drains. Comes to Bengaluru 2022 built over lake beds and stormwater channels. IT corridors submerged. Hyderabad 2020 encroached nalas and lakes. Record October rainfall. Two of these with the cause named answer any urban flood question. So these are the examples: Mumbai, Hyderabad, Bengaluru, and Chennai. Then we are moving to scene number 4, the fresh answer, that is the fresh answer. The fresh answer, that is the urban authority, the urban plan. Here is what makes your 2026 urban flood answer current and superior. The new institutions from chapter 2 applied for years. For years, the weakness in urban flooding was institutional. No single body owned the problem. Municipal corporations, development authorities, water boards, and disaster agencies each held a piece, and floods fell through the gaps between them. The Disaster Management Amendment Act of 2025 addresses exactly this. The Urban Disaster Management Authority, the 2025 Act, empowers states to constitute a UDMA for state capitals and municipal corporation cities, chaired by the municipal commissioners. It prepares an urban plan addressing city specific vulnerabilities, naming urban flooding explicitly. The 2025 amendment thus enables for the first time the dedicated urban disaster institutions to plan for floods, where a state chooses a constitute one. So the modern answer no longer stops to improve drainage. It says a dedicated urban authority preparing a statutory urban plan integrating flood risk into city planning, the institutional fix for an uninstitutional failure. So the urban flooding as an emerging climate induced disaster, this question asked in 2024. Causes, two major flood examples, and the policies and frameworks that tackle them. This is the answer for answer writing. And then reasons for urban floods and cause mechanism for preparedness. This question asked in 2016, 12.5 marker. The UDMA is a fresh framework element that no pre 2025 answer can offer. So then we are moving to scene number 5, that is the spongicity and nature based solutions. Now the solution philosophy, and it is the same one that runs through this whole syllabus. The old approach fought water with gray water with the gray engineered infrastructures, bigger concrete drains, higher walls, faster channels to flush water away. The modern approach works with nature, the sponge city model, letting the city absorb, store, and slowly release water, the way its natural landscape once did. The nature based, this is the old gray, this is the modern approach. The nature based solutions for urban flooding restore urban wetlands and lakes, the original stormwater sponges, build blue green infrastructures, parks, permeable surfaces, restore urban and wetland and lakes, blue-green infrastructure, protect and de-encroach natural drainage channels, risk sensitivity floodplain zoning, keep water path clear. So these, so blue-green infrastructure, park, permeable surfaces, rain gardens, etc. So, but carry the essential caveat, that is the one that shows sophistication. Nature-based solutions must complement, not replace, sound engineering. A city needs both restored wetlands and functioning drains. Nature-based solutions is not a substitute for hard infrastructure. Where hard infrastructure is needed, it is what makes the whole system resilient rather than brittle. So urban flood management must shift from a purely grey engineering model to sponge city approaches that restores wetlands, blue-green infrastructure, nature-based solutions complementing, not replacing, sound drainage governed through a new urban disaster management authority. So the riverine flood sets the baseline, and even there the shift from flood control to flood management, from embankments to room for the river. The urban floods is the manufactured disaster where encroached wetlands, sealed ground, and choked drains turn climate driven rainfall into catastrophe. The fresh answer is institutional, the Urban Disaster Management Authority and its urban plan, and the solution philosophy is the sponge city and nature based solutions complementing sound engineering. Trace it back through the three questions, that is damage, governance failure, and a remedy. The damage, what is the damage here? Water the city can no longer absorb or drain. Governance failure, encroachment, sealed ground, no institution showing the problem. Comes to the remedy part, the urban authority, sponge city design, wetland restoration, floodplain zoning. We have covered the two great climate driven hazards, that is heat and flood. Now we turn the hazards that come from the earth itself, that is sudden, violent, and among the most trusted in this tested in this paper, that is earthquakes, tsunamis, and landslides. This chapter is called as geophysical hazards. What are the geophysical hazards? We now turn from the climate driven hazards to the hazards of solid earth. And this family is by count the most tested in the entire paper. Earthquakes appeared in 2015 and again in 2021. Tsunami was full 15 marker question in 2017. Landslides appeared in 2019 and again 2021. That is 5 questions from one hazard family in a decade. So there is a note on cycles worth carrying. Landslides were asked recently as 2021. So we will cover them thoroughly but efficiently. Recurrence can guide how we weight a topic, though it is never predictive law. Earthquakes remain a priority for a firmer reason. They have been tested repeatedly. India's seismic vulnerability remains very high, and the preparedness gap persists. That combination, not a calendar, is why they matter. All three share one feature that shapes how you answer them. They are sudden onset, little or no warning. which means the entire weight of managing them falls on preparedness and mitigation before the event, not response after. That is the through line of this chapter. So this is the most tested hazard family: earthquakes, tsunami, landslides, and cycles, etc. Then we are moving to scene number two, that is earthquakes mechanism and India's vulnerability. Here you have to apply the template. Mechanism first. An earthquake is sudden release of energy in the earth's crust as accumulated stress along fault is released and the ground shakens. India's earthquakes are driven by one great phase fact of geology. The India plate is colliding with Eurasian plate, pushing under it, raising the Himalayas, and storing enormous seismic stress along that collision zone. That this is why the entire Himalayan belt is among the most seismically active regions on Earth. So India's vulnerability is mapped through seismic zones. The country is divided into zones 2, 3, 4, and 5 in increasing order risk. Zone 5 is the highest, covers the Himalayas, the northeast, Kutch, and the Andaman Nicobar Islands. A large and growing share of India lies in the higher risk zones. But and this is the analytical heart. The disaster is not the earthquake, it is the collapse of unsafe buildings. Earthquakes don't kill people, buildings do. India's real vulnerability is a vast stock of non engineered, unregulated construction in high risk zones, built with no seismic standards and no enforcement. So, the mitigation focus, therefore, is structural, not predictive. We cannot predict earthquakes, so we must build for them. Enforce the national building code and seismic codes, retrofit vulnerable existing buildings, schools, hospitals, lifeline structures first, and build capacity among masons and engineers. The NDMA's the NDMA's earthquake guidelines center on exactly this: earthquake resistant construction. So earthquake resistant construction. Then comes to case study bank. Earthquake Bhuj Gujarat 2001, 7.7 million approximately catastrophic catalyst for the DM Act 2005 itself. Latur, Maharashtra 1993 struck a stable continental region through thought low risk. A warning: Uttarakashi 1991 and Sikkim 2011 Himalayan belt events. Site with region and one feature exactly what 2021 question asked. Different parts of India. India's vulnerability to earthquakes. Examples with salient features from different parts of India over 3 decades. This question asked in 2021 10 markers. Frequency appeared to have increased. India's preparedness has significant gaps. This question asked in 2015 12.5 marker question. So this is the regarding earthquakes, and we are moving to tsunami. Scene number 3. Tsunami mechanism on 2004 watershed. Tsunami was a 15 marker in 2017 tied to the 2004 catastrophe. Cover it fully. So comes to the mechanism part. A tsunami is not a wind driven wave. It is a series of ocean waves generated by sudden vertical displacements of the seabed, most often from a subduction zone earthquake, where one tectonic plate thrusts under another and lifts the water column above it. In the deep ocean, the wave is low and fast. As it reaches shallow coast, it slows and rears up into devastating surge. The 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, triggered by Great Sumatra earthquake, struck 14 countries, including India's eastern coast and the Andaman Nicobar Islands, was the watershed that transformed India's disaster architecture. So it was the decisive trigger for the Disaster Management Act of 2005 and the creation of the NDMA. Building on lessons already emerging from the 1919 Odisha super cyclone and the 2001 Bhuj earthquake, and it produced a concrete institutional legacy, the answer to preparedness. So tsunami early warning after 2004, India established the Indian Tsunami Early Warning Center run by INCOIS in Hyderabad, operational from 2007. A 24 by 7 system of seabed sensors, tide gauges, and seismic monitoring that can issue coastal warnings within minutes. India Center now serves as a regional warning provider for the Indian Ocean. The 2017 question asked for preparedness in the light of NDM guidelines. The answer is like this: multi hazard early warning, the Tsunami Warning Center, coastal community preparedness, and mock drills, hazard mapping of the coast, and resilient coastal infrastructure, and the shift from a coast caught unaware in 2004 to a coast with minutes of warning today. So this is the changing scenario from 2004 to now. So this is all regarding about tsunami and with data also. Then we are moving to landslides. Landslides causes, effects and donation. Landslides asked in 2019 and 2021. Covered thoroughly but efficiently. Covered thoroughly but efficiently. Comes to the mechanism part. A landslide is the downslope movement of rock debris or soil. When the forces pulling the slope down exceeds the forces holding it together. The trigger starts and note the mix of natural human. Triggers for natural and human. Intense rainfall saturating the slope, the commonest trigger. This is seismic shaking, slope steepness and weak geology, and a rising human contribution like road cutting, unplanned construction, deforestation, tunnel planning, and mining that undercut and destabilize fragile hillsides, etc. This is why the Himalayas and the Western Ghats are India's landslide spots. Comes to the effects part: loss of life and property, blocked roads and severe connectivity, dammed rivers that can burst and cutting to the analytical point. Landslides are increasingly a development induced hazard worsened by building behind a slopes carrying capacity. The 2021 question asked specifically for the national landslide risk management strategy, and the 2019 question for hazard donation mapping. So name these precisely in your answers. Comes to the landslide mitigation, the national landslide risk management strategy covers hazard donation and susceptibility mapping, early warning systems, substantial stabilization of vulnerable slopes, regulation of hill slope construction, regulation of hill slope construction, capacity building and awareness. Landslide hazard donation mapping comes to this. Dividing terrain by susceptibility is the foundational tool. So it tells planners where not to build and where to concentrate mitigation. The Geological Survey of India leads this mapping. So comes to the case study bank. Landslides Wayanad Kerala 2024. Devastating rain triggered landslides. Western Ghats fragility. Malin Maharashtra 2014. A village buried linked to slope disturbance. Then Kedarnath region 2013. Rain and flood triggered mass movement. Causes and effects of landslides. Components of the national landslide risk management strategy question asked in 2021 15 marker. How hazard donation mapping helps landslide mitigation 2019 question 15 marker this is. And then we are moving to common thread, that is preparedness over prediction. So here landslides, mechanisms, triggers, mitigation part, case study part, Wayanad, PYQ corner, analytic, analyting, analytical point, that is effects, lives, property, damaged rivers, exactly, etc., etc. And then we are moving to the last scene, that is the common thread, preparedness over prediction. Before we close, draw the thread that ties this whole chapter together, because it is a ready-made framework for any geophysical hazard answer. None of these three can be reliably predicted. We cannot forecast the day of an earthquake, and the tsunami gives only a minutes. A landslide sometimes only movements. So unlike a cyclone, which we can track for days, geophysical hazards defeat a prediction based strategy. So the entire weight therefore falls on what you do before, like hazard mapping, knowing where the risk is, like seismic zones, landslide susceptibility, coastal exposure. Then comes to mitigation by construction, building to codes, retrofitting, zoning out of danger, and early warning where possible. The tsunami center being the model. So, unpreparedness, drills, community awareness, first responder capacity, these are needed. Preparedness over prediction. So, because geophysical hazards cannot be predicted. Resilience depends not on forecasting but on preparedness. Hazard zonation, code compliant, and retrofitted construction and community readiness. These the disaster lies less in the hazard than in vulnerability we build. So earthquakes driven by the Indian Eurasian collision. The disaster is unsafe buildings. So mitigation is structural. This is recap. Chapter recap. Codes retrofitting. The National Building Code. Tsunami. So comes to the tsunami subduction driven. The 2004 watershed that built India's disaster architecture and Inca's warning center that now gives the coast minutes it once lacked. And landslides, lands comes to the landslides, rainfall, and increasingly development triggered managed through hazard zonation and national landslide risk management strategy. And the common thread here is preparedness over prediction, because these hazards cannot be forecast, only prepared for. So map into the spine, comes to the spine map, that is damage, sudden violent ground and sea movement. Comes to the governance failure, unsafe construction, unmapped risk building beyond carrying capacity. Remedy, hazard zonation, code enforcement, retrofitting, early warning, preparedness. So we have covered the earth's sudden hazards. Next we going to the mountains, where climate and geology combine into a fast emerging disaster of our warming era, that is glacial lakes, cloud bursts, and the fragile Himalaya. We are going to discuss in the next chapter, that is next class, seventh chapter.